Hi, I'm Larry Becker, and today we've put together a class on overcoming the challenges of low-light photography with today's DSLR cameras and changeable lens mirrorless cameras. Since the beginning of photographic history, no matter what technology was being used to capture images, from tintypes to film and now digital sensors, one of the challenges has always been getting enough light to capture a good image with enough detail, especially in low-light environments. The good news is that today's higher-end cameras, like changeable lens mirrorless cameras and DSLRs, have a bunch of settings that you can adjust, plus high-quality lenses that you can add to make them more sensitive in low light. And then there are add-on flashes, often referred to as speedlights, that can fill a room with plenty of light to let your camera easily capture a great image. Now, there are 3 settings that you can adjust to help your camera get enough light for an exposure. You can increase the sensitivity of your camera to light, you can open the aperture wider to let in more light all at once, and you can keep the shutter open longer to let in more light over time. Let's start by talking about how sensitive your camera's image sensor is to light. This is called your camera's ISO setting, and each camera has a range of sensitivity levels, usually starting at the least sensitive setting with a number around 100, and then going up to a high number like 6400 with this Nikon D7000, 12,800 for this Canon T4i, and 3200 in auto ISO mode for the Sony NEX6. And by the way, these numbers can be boosted with internal software, so technically all 3 of these cameras have an expanded ISO range up to 25,600. But in a minute we'll talk about why that doesn't usually matter. On the low end of the range, where the sensor is least sensitive to light, you can easily take pictures outdoors during the day, but you would probably have dark or underexposed images indoors. So indoors, in bright environments, you might bump your camera ISO up to 200 or even 400, or possibly even higher. This is one of those things where you'll benefit from practicing with your camera so that you start to see what settings are needed based on available light. But it's inevitable that indoor pictures of family gatherings, especially when it's dark outside, will have so little light that you'll need an ISO of 800, 3200, 6400, or maybe even higher. The reason this becomes a problem is that these higher sensitivity settings make the sensor less accurate, and you'll start to see some visual static. We call it image noise. And the higher the ISO, the more noise you'll see. So a couple final notes about ISO. First, set up some dark environments at your house and then practice taking pictures while adjusting your ISO to higher and higher numbers. And look at the results to see how much noise might be acceptable to you. Second, so you don't have to always be thinking about resetting your ISO, consider turning on your camera's auto ISO if your camera has that feature. All 3 of these cameras have it. That way your camera will let you set other variables and it'll help you compensate automatically. Just keep in mind, higher ISO settings will give you different quality results from one camera to the next. Besides adjusting ISO, keeping the shutter open longer will let in more light. A faster shutter speed, like 1/2000th of a second, is great for freezing action when you have bright sunshine and you want to freeze an athlete or an auto race. But as the amount of available light goes down, your shutter will need to stay open longer to gather enough light. All these cameras have something called shutter priority mode. It's the S setting on the Nikon and the Sony, and it's TV, that stands for time value, on the Canon camera. And then you can manually adjust your camera's shutter speed. But keep in mind that the longer the shutter stays open, the greater your chance for blurry images. You can compensate a little bit by using a lens with built-in image stabilization or vibration reduction, and this Sony NEX has stabilization built into the camera body itself. And then stand with your feet shoulder width apart and tuck your elbows next to your body and make yourself as steady as possible. But good camera holding technique and image stabilization can only help you so much. When light is so dim your shutter has to stay open for a 1/15 of a second or longer, maybe even a second or two, there's no way a human can hold a camera still enough to get a tack-sharp picture. That's why photographers use tripods, and the real pros combine that with a remote trigger so they don't even shake their camera a little bit by touching the shutter button. Now let me tell you about something photographers call the first tripod penalty fee. And for the record, I have paid this fee myself. It refers to new photographers who finally realize they need a tripod and they try to save a little money by buying the cheapest one they can find. My first tripod came from a big box store years ago. Then as soon as I started using it, I discovered all kinds of problems with the quality of the tripod. And it wasn't very long at all before I bought a great tripod that I still have and use years later. And I've never looked back. So the penalty fee photographers joke about is the money wasted on that economical tripod. My 3-point buyer's guide to getting your first tripod is to make sure that you buy one that's rated to handle several more pounds than your gear actually weighs, so it's rock solid when you're shooting. Next, make sure it's tall enough so that it'll hold your camera at eye level when you're standing. There's nothing worse than always having to bend over to take every single picture. And finally, if you're going to shoot landscapes or do any kind of photography where you'd be traveling with your tripod quite a bit, or if you plan to shoot outdoors in cold climates, it's worth a little extra money to invest in a carbon fiber tripod right up front. That's because they're lighter weight and just as sturdy as aluminum, and they don't get so cold to the touch when you're shooting in snowy landscapes. This is the Oben CC2320. And it's a great carbon fiber option. Just one final note about tripods. Some come with an adjustable ball head and some are just the tripod legs. So if the tripod you're buying doesn't have a ball head already, you'll need to get one so that you can point your camera where you want. This particular tripod came with an Oben ball head. So we've covered ISO sensitivity and shutter speed. The remaining camera setting you can adjust to get enough light for a picture is how wide your lens opening is. This is called the aperture, and it's measured in a number called the f-stop number. You can put any of these 3 cameras and just about any DSLR or mirrorless camera into aperture priority mode, so that way you can pick the f-stop manually. If you're new to this, it can be a little bit confusing, but essentially the smallest f-stop numbers are the biggest opening. For example, f1.4 is a really wide opening, and f22 is a really tiny opening. And just like everything else in photography, as you change the f-stop values, it could affect your images in ways that you might not always want. For example, if you're relatively close to your subject and you have a wide aperture, like f1.4, a really shallow part of your image is going to be in focus. If you're shooting bridal portraits and the bride's eyes are in focus, her ears might be a little blurry and the background could be so out of focus that you can't make out a thing. For bridal portraits, that's just fine. But if you want everything to be in focus, you'll need to reduce your aperture. Remember, that means a bigger number, and you'll want something like f8 or f11. That means that there's going to be a smaller opening, so your shutter speed or your ISO will need to be adjusted to compensate for the smaller aperture. Then again, if you're a bit further away from your subject, f1.4 or f1.8 might have plenty of your subject in focus. There's one more consideration when it comes to these wider aperture settings. Most kit lenses, the lenses that come with your camera when you buy it, don't have these wide aperture settings available. For example, this Nikon D7000 came with a great versatile lens. It's an 18 to 200 millimeter f3.5 to 5.6 zoom lens. That means when it's zoomed to its widest 18 millimeter setting, the widest aperture you can get is f3.5. And when you zoom to the 200 millimeter end, the widest aperture available is f5.6. So this is a situation where you might consider buying some additional lenses with wider aperture settings available. So let's take a minute and look at our 3 example cameras here and some great lens options that'll give you more flexibility in low light. And by the way, when you're at a local camera club meeting and you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, pros call lenses with wide aperture capabilities for letting in a lot of light fast glass. So our first piece of fast glass for the Nikon family is this surprisingly affordable Nikon 50mm AFS f1.8 lens. Now keep in mind that since it's not a zoom lens, if you want to get closer to your subject, you're going to have to physically move closer. In the Canon family, we have a couple of really nice examples, like this 35mm f2 or this 50mm f1.4. When it comes to the Nikon and Canon family of DSLRs, there are all kinds of lenses available, and there are even lenses available from third-party makers. With mirrorless cameras, though, there are fewer choices because this category of changeable lens cameras is fairly new. Still, there are some great lens options, like this Sony 50mm f1.8 lens. Beyond camera settings, you can add more light to your environment to improve your images. Of course, there's always the obvious stuff that you can do, like turning on all the lights in a room or even taking off lampshades temporarily. One great piece of inexpensive equipment I almost always recommend immediately to my friends getting into photography is a 5-in-1 reflector. You can use it to bounce available light at your subject, and you can even control the quality of that light. For example, the silver side is going to bounce the most light, the white or a soft silver side will soften that bounced light, and the gold side will warm up the light and change the tone of your image. Making the most of available light is great, but there's one final solution that gives photographers the power to add an amazing amount of controlled light to practically any family gathering, and it's called a flash unit. Now, most photographers refer to these as speed lights or hot shoe flashes since they mount on your camera's hot shoe. You can buy a dedicated speed light made by your camera's manufacturer, and frequently you can get aftermarket lights like this one. This is a Metz Mechablitz 50 AF1. This one even uses Canon technology, so it can work seamlessly with your Canon through-the-lens metering. Of course, this isn't an in-depth class all about flashes and flash power and settings, but there are a few things that you should know to improve your flash photography right away. First, a camera-mounted flash pointed directly at your subject is almost always going to be bad. It creates hard shadows and harsh highlights, and sometimes even red eye. First, try bouncing it off of a ceiling or the wall, especially if the ceiling or walls are white. That'll add a smoothness to the light falling on the whole room. If your camera's flash system has the built-in capability to remotely trigger flash units, getting your flash off the camera is great because then you can put your light source somewhere else in the room or just hold it away from the camera. There are various technologies that can trigger flashes remotely. There's wired, infrared, and wireless radio triggers, like this Velo Freewave Fusion Flash Trigger and Receiver. So you can buy aftermarket systems like this if your camera and flash don't already have some sort of remote communication built in. And here's a cool one. A lot of people don't know about this. It's the Metz Mechalux 11 optical slave trigger, and you just clip it onto your flash's hot shoe connector. Then any blink of light from any camera, even a point and shoot pop-up, will set off the flash. At family gatherings, I usually set up 2 remote flashes around the room and turn down the power of my pop-up flash. That way, the pop-up flash is so dim that it doesn't add to the exposure and then wash out my subject, but that flash is still bright enough to remotely trigger the flash units. There's no question that capturing good images in low light is a matter of knowing your camera, your lenses, and maybe even adding a spark of flash to the scene. And what we've covered here should get you well on your way to converting plain old snapshots into well-lit, beautifully captured memories. For B&H and Kelby Training, I'm Larry Becker. Thanks for watching.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.